welcome to London, Ron. You're on your way to Paris,
yes,
to the annual ritual of the Green Bloc or the Green Movement. You've been there how many times, and what do you expect?
Well,
different this time, different to the other times.
Different this time. I've actually attended as a reporter over 12 of these at this point. I was my first experience of this was actually at Rio at the Earth Summit in 1992, where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was first negotiated. So I've been looking at this for quite some time. As I tell people, going to UN climate meetings is an acquired taste. Interestingly, let me contrast this with the earlier thing that happened in Copenhagen in 2009. One of the things that I was fascinated by at Copenhagen as a journalist, what I loved is that actual news occurred. It's usually so well managed by the UN that nothing ever untoward or unexpected occurs. Copenhagen collapsed, essentially. And one of the things that I found very amusing is that typically they had over 150 leaders, quote unquote, flying in for that to sign what was going to be a binding treaty. And what happened is that it collapsed, and they all fled on their airplanes as fast as possible. Usually at these meetings, there's a class photo, right, where all the leaders are standing on risers and smiling for the camera. There was no class photo for Copenhagen. It was a complete failure, and you know that because there was no class photo. I've noticed that the Paris meeting, they said, let's go in at the beginning, cut the ribbon, and run away then. There is a class photo for that meeting. They're all on risers and so forth. So what do we expect out of this? Basically, not very much. What will happen is, if anything happens, and there's still a good chance that it might not happen, is that there'll be an agreement to say, we all agree that we're going to do our best efforts to improve the climate over the next, between 2020 and 2025. And whether they will do much about that or not, we shall see. It's in the details. Will countries consent to monitoring? Will they allow other people to know what they're up to and so forth? My best guess is that probably no, in which case it's going to be a trust but not verified sort of agreement.
Now, President Obama in Copenhagen promised the developing world an annual fund of $100 billion annually. Right. That's not going to happen. So how are they going to deal with the fact that this promise will never materialize?
I suspect if this goes forward at all, it will get papered over. There will be urgent meetings following this the next year and the next year and the next year, where we will finally figure out how to get $100 billion to, in sort of, if you will, climate reparations to developing countries. And as you say, it's simply not going to materialize. There may be ways in which the developed countries, the rich countries, basically say, well, if we take into account all kinds of private flows of money and investment, and basically they will just cobble together some sort of analysis saying, this is extra money. There'll be no way of proving that it isn't extra money. There'll be no way of proving it was extra money. And I really doubt that the poor countries are going to go with that. What they really want is taxpayer dollars shoveled out of the pockets of rich country taxpayers into, if you will, the giant bureaucracies of their countries.
Right. I mean, there's obviously an alternative, and the American administration has now suggested that in Paris, and that is to actually ask the developing countries to put in some money into this, basically paying themselves. What do you, and of course the Indians are up in arms about this. What do you make of the wealthy West asking poor countries to actually pay for this themselves?
Well, to the extent that there is a problem and that their leaders and the poor countries think that it is a problem, then obviously they should adapt to it. They should, in fact, be spending their taxpayer monies on these particular issues. To the extent they don't think it's a problem, which I suspect in the back of their heads they don't really think it's that big a problem, they're not going to. So essentially what you're going to have is if you will, what they used to call the fan dance, where basically a dancer would always, a lovely young lady would be strategically hiding various aspects of her physique, and nobody could ever see what was going on. And this is what's going to happen with this result.
Right. Final question about Paris. How is this being perceived and received in the US? How is this playing out? And I mean, this conflict between the Democrats and the Republicans.
Well, interestingly, there was a recent poll where Americans, 2/3 of Americans, said that they would like a successful outcome in Paris. They would like something to be done about the climate. That was a very open-ended question. They were not asked, well, how much more would you like to pay for electricity? How much more would you like to pay for gasoline? How much more would you like to pay for food? Those kinds of things. If they were asked that, my suspicion is that the numbers would be considerably lower. Elite opinion, by which I mean the elite opinions that occupy the op-ed pages of our main newspapers, are saying this is an urgent crisis, we must do something, so forth. But it's not going to happen. Oddly, the Republican Party in the United States is very, very strongly skeptical, if you will, of the claims, the scientific claims about global warming. And I think that that's probably going to be a mistake at some point. What they should be doing is focusing on what policies should be developed, and they're not doing that so much. They're basically saying, we're not going to do anything if there's no problem, but they really should be thinking about, if there is a problem, what should we do that would actually help both the climate and the economy, and they're not looking in that direction, unfortunately.
Great. You're giving a talk tonight in the House of Lords about your new book, The End of Doom, which is a great title, but is it really the end of doom? I mean, it doesn't feel like the end of doom.
Well, first of all, it doesn't feel that way because there are cadres and cadres of people who are selling doom. Let's face it, if you're an environmental group, the way you make money is sending a letter to somebody, a solicitation letter saying, send money now or this panda bear will be killed. You basically have to sell doom. And so by doing that, as a market for doom, you, if you will, pollute the discourse that people are in. But if you actually look, and I tried to do this fairly comprehensively in my new book, at the data with all sorts of global trends, you will find that the world is probably in better shape than it's ever been in all of human history.
Why is it so difficult to convey that message, given that you're not the only one? There are quite a number of authors who have either published...
Who are realists, I prefer to say.
Realists,
yes.
Who are looked at the data and seen the economic development, seen environmental improvement, seen even the reduction in violence and wars.
Right.
But the message doesn't seem to resonate. What's the blockage? What's the hurdle to make people aware of these positive developments?
Well, of course, one thing you might do is buy lots of copies of my book and give it to all your friends. But aside from that, the main problem, I suspect, is a glitch in human psychology. And one way you think about it is that we're the descendants of very cautious people. Think of it this way. In the environment when humans were first evolving, a guy would be wandering along and he would hear a rustle in the bushes, and he might think to himself, oh, that's just the wind. Another one who was a little more cautious might think, there could be a lion hiding behind that bush, and he would run away. Well, the guy who thought it might be the wind, and it turned out to be a lion, got selected out. He is not our ancestor. We are the descendants of the cautious ones who runs away. So we focus on bad news, and it's much more easy to get our attention. If you think about it, 99% of everybody's day, at least in the Western world, goes most of the time perfectly fine. That's that 1% that is news, and that is what you see reported all the time. You don't see the other 99% reported. So there's a mismatch about what we hear and what we experience, and we focus, unfortunately, on what we hear.
So let me ask you about your early years, because you write in your book that you, when you were young, just like me, in the 70s, you were actually very much concerned about the bad news that we got all the time. And many of the realists today used to be more alarmist when they were young. So the question is, what made you at what point did you reconsider the concern then try to look at the facts and look at the data and say, hold on, I have come to the conclusion it's not that bad on a number of issues that you write about.
Well, as you point out, when I was at university in the early 1970s, I was being taught, let's say, what are now the canonical books of environmentalism, Silent Spring, The Limits to Growth, and of course the Population Bomb. And basically, as a young man in my early 20s, I kind of believed that my professors were right, that my life was going to be fairly miserable and short, and the world was going to become more or less a hellhole fairly quickly, certainly before the end of the 20th century. Well, in the fullness of time, in the late 80s and early 90s, I'm working as a reporter at Forbes magazine in New York, and I noticed that we're still here. And not only were we still here, things were a lot better than they had been in the 1970s. People were richer, they were living longer, energy was more abundant, resources were more abundant, the air was pollution was going down, those kinds of things. So my idea that I proposed to my editor was, well, I will reread these books and then go to the people who wrote them and sit down with them and ask them, well, what happened? My rather naive expectation at the time was that they were going to go, oh, thank goodness, Ron, that I was wrong. It's wonderful that I was wrong. Well, okay, so I interviewed Paul Ehrlich, the author of The Population Bomb, who had basically said, not basically, he flat out said, hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now in the 1970s. So I talked to Paul, and Paul goes, well, Ron, I got my timing wrong. The famines are still going to come. I didn't realize how productive people might be, but the same dynamic is there. The bomb is still going off. We're going to have famines. And I go, well, so when are they going to happen? This was, remember, in 1990. And he goes, well, it's going to happen between 2000 and 2010. It's 2015 now. Still no famines, Paul. Yet he still predicts it, unfortunately, in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. I also went to the MIT folks who were behind the Limits to Growth, and I sat down for a whole day and discussed with them, went through the book page by page, and one of them eventually turned to me and said, all right, Ron, we overemphasized the material resources side. Remember, these are the people who were saying that we were going to be totally out of oil, tin, zinc, silver, all these metals and energy supplies by 2000. So did you call up the New York Times and tell them that you were wrong? No. So eventually, during the reporting of this, it occurred to me that these people are not making scientific claims, they're making ideological claims. Of the following, is that if this is my predicted doom, and if you don't do exactly what I want you to do socially and economically, the world will come to an end. And so there was always a political program lurking behind what was dressed up as science, unfortunately. And that is, unfortunately, still the modus operandi of the environmental movement today. So that's why I changed my mind.
Right. Well, there's one issue where you actually changed your mind twice, in a way, or at least
well, let's see what you think. All right.
And you mentioned that on one issue, you are still you are more concerned than you used to be, perhaps in the 80s. You think that climate change might be a potential problem in the future.
Yep.
My question is, clearly that was a change of view. What made you become concerned?
Okay. When I first did reporting on this, and I had an earlier book called EcoScam, when I reported a lot of these trends and so forth, and I had a chapter on climate change, and I was very skeptical of climate change in that book. This was in 1992. And I was in good company. At the time, the National Academy of Sciences had just put out a report which, in the United States, which was stressing the uncertainties with regard to the future trajectory of possible man-made climate change. And so I was not alone in this skepticism. And the reason I was skeptical is I'd seen this in so many other domains of environmental discourse that I was going, well, this is the next one. Well, I have, as I said, I've been following this issue ever since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, been to a lot of conferences. I've talked to scores and scores of scientists. I read fairly deeply and widely in the actual scientific literature, been to conferences. And slowly but surely, the accumulating evidence for me, put me into what I call not a beyond a reasonable doubt view with regard to the possibility that man-made climate change could be a problem, but a balance of the evidence test. I do ask people, is it just a coincidence that as carbon dioxide levels have reached relatively unprecedented levels, that average global temperature has been going up? And I don't think it is a coincidence. It is still a debatable point, and there's certainly a lot of the science that is not settled, despite what people say. But on the balance, I believe that it could be a problem and that we should probably begin to think about policies to address it.
You also review the latest research in this book on climate change, in particular climate sensitivity.
Yes.
Now, does the fact that the climate isn't warming as much as was perhaps thought or predicted 20 years ago give you a little bit more or less concern? I mean, you say you look at the evidence and you have a balanced view on the climate, but given that I think a third of all CO2 emissions ever emitted by humans occurred over the last 25 years, during which time temperatures really haven't risen that dramatically, certainly not as fast. Does that give you some reassurance that it might not be such a big problem, or do you think there might still be a big surprise in the pipeline?
The issue of climate sensitivity is a highly contested one. The good news for humanity is that the estimates of it are going down. Climate sensitivity is basically the amount of warming that you might expect for a doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the future. And those estimates have been trending downward lately, and if that is true, that is very good news. On the other hand, the notion that there's a hiatus or a pause, that there hasn't been much of an increase in the last 18, 20 years or so, is a highly contested one. There's a huge amount of research going on, and how shall we say this? It is my considered opinion that there's a lot of confirmation bias going on in the research on both sides. And so it's really hard to sort it out at this early date on who might or might not be right. I hope that the lukewarmers, that is, the people who think that the temperature likely to rise in the future will be lower rather than higher, are correct, but I don't think we need to bet on that. But I have said one thing, that there are a lot of now falsifiable projections and predictions that are being made by the people who are concerned, and they are arguing that they expect temperatures to go up rather rapidly in the next 5 to 10 years. And if it doesn't, then I'm pretty sure then this issue will go away as a major policy problem. And I hope that that will be the case for the sake of humanity.
Yes. Well, I think that's a very wise and very rational position to take. I personally have exactly the same view. We don't really know how the whole complexity, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 20 years, but it will be the proof of the pudding.
Will be.
And as you said, if it's going to accelerate, policies will have to change. If it's not, they will go away.
They will go away.
Now, let's focus just at the end of the interview on the policy aspects. Okay. And I would like to ask you a few questions about what you call the new energy and climate consensus. Yes. You think that the new consensus, and there's some evidence, even now in Paris, Bill Gates has announced this kind of breakthrough energy coalition. Right. The new consensus is we have to develop, and you're right, technologies, alternative technologies that are essentially able to compete with fossil fuels that are actually cheaper. Right. I think everyone people who realize that the policies now being adopted don't work, they're not doing anything, are beginning to realize that, but they are calling, of course, now for huge amounts of funding, Apollo project, Manhattan project, we're talking hundreds of billions of R&D Here's the question: where should the money be spent? I mean, should it be showered onto every experiment in every lab in the country? Sure. How do you allocate R&D money if you don't know where the breakthrough eventually will happen?
Fortunately, I'm not a funder, so I don't know. It's an interesting question. Let me take it another way. The policies that have been being advocated over time, something like internationally harmonized carbon taxes or a cap and trade system, or that kind of these things. The idea was they were going to call forth the technologies that we need, and to the extent that they've been operating, for example, the European Trading Scheme, as far as I can tell, they've called forth no new technologies. They're basically forcing countries to the extent that they do, to deploy highly subsidized, very clunky old technologies. I mean, and they're very expensive, and they're not getting the job done. So we know that policy's failed. So to the extent that there is a problem, a cheaper way, think about it this way. Would you want to spend $1 trillion a year on deploying clunky wind and solar power that we have now, or would you rather spend $100 billion a year trying to find something that is better, that is cheaper than fossil fuels? And if you're thinking about, here's what I want to think about. If you think that the bastards are going to do something anyway, then what you should be doing is selecting the policies where they do the least harm. And so I would suggest a massive R&D push would be a policy that does the least harm, both to the economy and to, if you will, the livelihoods of people around the globe. With regard to how you would distribute this kind of money, which I think should be both, and as you point out, Bill Gates is doing this, it should be both public and private. You need to have the private because they are the sorts of people who know how to target research a lot better than, shall we say, wise bureaucrats sitting in the Department of Energy in Washington, D.C. The same sort of people who gave us the famous case of Solyndra, for example, the failed solar energy company that lost about $500 million. But what I would say is that whatever research and development monies are spent, it should be on research and development. It should not be on deployment at all. It should be focusing on how to figure out how to make energy cheaper. And there are all kinds of ways of doing it. I'm not talking about just renewables, who knows? Everybody has their own policy preferences, technologies. Mine is probably new nuclear power. There are wonderful new designs, some of which would actually use nuclear waste. The piles and piles and piles of nuclear waste we have scattered around the planet as fuel. In fact, some analyses for these designs basically say we wouldn't have to mine a single atom more of uranium to power the entire planet for 1,000 years. All right, that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but that should be explored. And then there are thorium reactors and so forth. But I don't want to predict what those breakthroughs will be. Some of them will also be in energy efficiency, frankly. The power industry, the electric power industry, is probably one of the least innovative industries on the planet. Why? Because it has been regulated from the beginning. There's the people who run electric power companies have no real incentive to improve the efficiency with which they create energy. Because they're not operating in markets. Most of them monopolies. Many of them are national monopolies. So where we find efficiencies in energy, we find it on the consumer side, where appliances and so forth improve all the time, where economies are being made. If we could somehow focus the attention more and create markets for actual energy, we will then speed up innovation in that area as well. Anyway, I understand that a lot of R&D will be wasted, but I would prefer to waste it there in the goal of finding a breakthrough technology as opposed to wasting it vastly more sums of money deploying clunky, old-fashioned solar and wind power.
Here's my final question. Everyone is expecting that the breakthrough eventually will happen with alternative energies, whether it's renewable or nuclear.
Sure.
The reality is that the biggest breakthroughs actually happen with conventional fossil fuel energy, shale, fracking.
Yes.
So that has made fossil fuels even cheaper.
Yes.
And the bridge to the alternatives has just become much, much longer.
Yes.
In the absence of a competitive alternative to cheap and abundant fossil fuels. And let's not forget, in Asia, Africa, they're building hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of coal-fired plants. In the absence of a technological solution to the CO2 problem, if there is a problem,
right,
what other policy alternatives do you see? If, in other words, if we still be 80%, I mean, the International Energy Agency predicts that by 2040, 80% of the energy mix globally will still be fossil fuels. And it might be in 2060, still 70 or 80%. Who knows?
Who knows? Well, that's, all right, here's the other way I think about these problems, though, is that we're trying in some sense, or the folks in Paris are trying to essentially figure out the energy use of people living 100 years from now. Now, people in 1915 in London, if you had put the smartest people around a table, the best scientists, Rutherford, whoever, got Einstein over from Switzerland, and said, so what will people be using in London in 2015 for energy? What do you think, and how much would they be using?
They would have said we would have been run out of coal.
Jevons had already written that. No, they would have said that, but they would also have not had computers, air conditioning, cars, electric lights, cameras, the entire world that we have. They would have been completely unable to model the energy future that we have. We are in exactly the same position in 2015. So I think that what I guess I'm doing is declining to make any speculation. What you need to do are to create the institutions that allow for as rapid innovation as possible. If you allow free markets to operate with strong property rights and good incentives for people to develop technologies, most of these problems will take care of themselves. And that is what we have to do. Unfortunately, what we find is most of the time, the sorts of people who are meeting in Paris want a top-down system which has always failed and will continue to fail to address the problem.
Ron, thank you very much.
Delighted to be here, Benny.